Welcome to Free Thoughts. I'm Aaron Powell.
And I'm Trevor Burrus.
Joining us today is Radu Uszkai. He's assistant lecturer at the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, an associated researcher at the Center of Institutional Analysis and Development, Eleutheria, and at the Research Center for Applied Ethics. Welcome to Free Thoughts, Radu.
Thanks, Aaron and Trevor, for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here.
We're going to talk about intellectual property today, and I want to start with just that very phrase, because I think one of the interesting parts about intellectual property is the question of, is it really even property in the first place?
That's a good question to start this discussion, because a huge chunk of time, effort, and papers have been dedicated to exactly this question, right? Whether or not we could actually talk about ascribing property rights in relation to basically ideas, to immaterial stuff like ideas. And within, let's say, the broad libertarian tradition, classical liberal libertarian tradition, this is quite a topic of contention, because we actually don't have, let's say, a unified libertarian stance on intellectual property. I mean, I'm not so sure that we have a lot of unified stances on a lot of stuff, but on intellectual property, we actually lack something like this. So, I mean, some classical liberals and libertarians, like Ayn Rand, for example. I mean, she said that individuals have the right to the product of their minds. Another, let's say, new scholar, Brian Quick, he's also famous for arguing in a Lockean framework in favor of ascribing property rights to ideas. But there's also this strong tradition against ascribing such rights, and especially due to the reason that we're talking about immaterial objects like ideas. There's this quite famous paper written by Stephen Kinsella, who's, I guess, quite famous in the let's say, general libertarian movement. And one of his counter arguments and critiques of intellectual property actually stems from the nature of immaterial objects, right? So he says that we typically and generally ascribe property rights, and property actually as an institution makes sense when we talk about scarce objects like, I don't know, bicycles, laptops, so on and so forth. Because there's a possibility of conflict in relation with them. Whereas when you talk about property rights, like ideas, there actually might not be a way in which you could actually say that you could steal something, right? So if you cannot steal something, if there's no possible conflict with regards to an object, then maybe even the phrase intellectual property actually doesn't make sense.
Does it matter how the philosophers? So we've had this question of different justifications for property. Does it matter that, like, Lockean justification for property, for example, or some sort of Kantian? How does that affect the intellectual property debate?
Well, it matters a lot because, and it also matters a lot because if you take a closer look at, let's say, various legal frameworks, both existing and in recent history, let's say, you can basically observe that, for example, European laws have this I don't know, Kantian/Hegelian flavor. European laws generally tend to favor this personhood approach to property rights when it comes to ideas, whereas the American system tends to be more utilitarian in its outlook. So it matters because, for example, I mean, some might argue that I don't know, Locke is not right when it comes to property, but that person could still argue within a utilitarian framework, for example, that we need intellectual property rights, because without intellectual property rights, individuals wouldn't have incentives to be creative. So it doesn't matter whether, I don't know, mixing your work with something that it's previously unknown is the basis of property. What matters is whether or not we have the right set of institutions in order to, let's say, increase the aggregate welfare at a social level. So it matters a lot because those positions aren't necessarily coherent.
We're talking today about an essay that you wrote, and we'll put in link up to this in the show notes. But the interesting contribution of your essay is to bring Hayek into this picture. So what does Hayek specifically bring to discussions of intellectual property? Because he doesn't seem to have said much actually about it himself.
Yeah, he actually didn't. I mean, there are some scarce remarks, for example, in The Fatal Conceit. But I mean, what I take from Hayek when analyzing social life and institutions is something that I call, let's say, Hayekian skepticism with regards to orders, with regards to state-enforced institutions. So Hayek is really interesting because he's fundamentally skeptical with regards to whether or not copyrights or even patents, but he's mostly focused on copyrights, actually do function as incentives for creators to be creative. And it's also interesting because copyrights, and especially copyrights, not only patents and other examples of intellectual property rights, are basically direct creations of the state. And it's interesting if we take a closer look at the specific history of copyrights, for example, in England. We see that copyrights are closely associated, for example, with religious wars, with monopolies, which kings and queens of medieval and early modern Europe tend to allocate. And they don't necessarily respond, let's say, to a need on the market of ideas or the market in economic terms. So it's I guess interesting to analyze this institution and its evolution and its meaning or its justification in present day in the present day global context with these two let's say lenses.
So in the Hayek context, though, you say he doesn't talk about it much. It sounds like, I think in your essay you found like all of the examples of him talking about.
I hope all of Hayek's quotes on copyrights and intellectual property are in my paper.
Yeah, and they're sort of asides almost. But how does that relate to? How did he think of physical property? Is there any connection between how we might expound on Hayek's views on intellectual property and how he felt about physical property?
Well, I mean, if we take a closer look at what intellectual property rights, or at one of the consequences that establishing intellectual property rights has, it's basically what he, and not only he, but a lot of liberals and classical liberals who discussed this topic, called forced scarcity, right? So ideas once produced aren't scarce as opposed to material objects. Right. If someone utters, I don't know, a poem or something like this, then basically that poem can become something that's close to a public good. It's basically the ideal public good, right? We could all listen to the same poem in the same time without, let's say, being in any rivalry situation when it comes to enjoying it. So when we talk about intellectual property rights, we're talking about actually establishing forced scarcity in order to, let's say, stimulate human creative processes. Whereas property rights in relation to material objects, they are basically a result of the fact that goods are scarce, right? It's a way of, by trial and error, as Hayek would put it, it's a way in which we basically manage to live in a world in which material objects are scarce.
Well, that's the interesting part too, because there's the part of Hayek that says that the physical property rights had an evolutionary element to them. They emerged in a sort of natural way, which is something very big for Hayek, not top-down constructivist rational ordering of society, but bottom-up solving of problems, as you mentioned. And as you pointed out, not only is that not true about intellectual property and where it came from, but also it has a very constructivist, rationalist, the state trying to control things origin, which I didn't know until I read your essay, actually. But it's even true now. I mean, they're always manipulating copyright, like say the duration or stuff, for the purposes of constructing like a more rational order, which might just mean that Mickey Mouse never goes out of copyright, for example.
Yeah, there's these two economists, Michele Boldrin, he's Italian if I'm not mistaken, and David K. Levine. They are the authors of this 2008 book, if I'm not mistaken, called Against Intellectual Monopoly. And they have this chapter titled The Evils in Disney. And it's basically about this, about how basically Mickey Mouse will be copyrighted forever and ever and ever. Even if, I mean, Walt Disney is like kind of dead for a lot of time. So it's interesting if you, I mean, analyze within, let's say, a public choice framework, what happens when states give either, let's say, creative individuals or companies such a power, how they basically tend to abuse it and how they tend to lobby international organizations like, I don't know, the World Trade Organization to impose strong protection of IP rights at the global level as actually a precondition for free trade agreements. So it's like a really interesting point again to look at within a public choice framework. And what I wanted to add, sorry for interrupting you. What I wanted to add is that the semantic part of how intellectual property rights appeared is like really interesting because they emerged as explicit form of privileges. So in Venice, for example, in medieval Venice, this is the way they were actually entitled as privileges. And in other places that they were basically framed as monopolies because they actually do function as monopolies, right? A company or an individual have a monopoly right with regards to reproducing a certain, I don't know, idea or any material object like a formula for something.
I was hoping you could speak to, in your essay, you raise, so we have this story that you just told of these institutions setting this up and granting monopolies and privileges. But you also talk about this fascinating, I don't know, cultural or even conceptual shift that seemed to drive it in terms of like the role of changing views of the role of the human mind in the creative process. And you compare it to like the Greeks, which one of the striking things, if you read Greek literature, Greek poetry, is it always starts with sing, O Muse, or some sort of appeal to the muses. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I found it totally fascinating.
Yeah, this is something that at a certain point, I don't know if this lockdown continues even more, and if I get a break from teaching online, or if I get fully accustomed to doing this, I would actually like to write a paper on this because I find the early modern pre-enlightenment and actually a bit of post-enlightenment to be actually an absolutely fascinating time in our history, because it's interesting to see how intellectual property rights and copyrights emerged as a result of certain, let's be amateur armchair historians and call them revolutions, right? We had a technological revolution. We had the invention, Gutenberg's invention, which basically fundamentally reduced the costs associated with reproducing books. But we also had this ongoing economic revolution, which basically contributed to this emergence of a middle class who had the resources to I don't know, send their kids to school, to also use reading as a way of spending their free time, so on and so forth. But also, and this is really important, that it comes from some French philosophers, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. I'm not necessarily a fan of Foucault, but it's interesting the way in which Foucault, but not only Foucault, analyzed this let's say evolution or actually emergence of this modern notion of being an author and of what authorship means. Because as you mentioned, Aaron, if we take a closer look at creativity in ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks tended to to look at the creative process as not necessarily being the result of your efforts. So for them, I don't know, a Lockean argument in favor of intellectual property rights would have sounded a bit bizarre, right? Poets or sculpture or I don't know, artists in general, they weren't the originators of the ideas, but they were basically a vehicle for muses or gods to I don't know, send some messages or transmit something with aesthetic value. This started to change a bit in Roman and especially in Byzantine times, but mostly during the Middle Ages, they were more or less Greek, in their outlook, because it wasn't necessarily the priest who was, let's say, the creator of something, even if we're talking about science. Priests, right, had this special link with God, and it was more or less God or certain saints who talked through them. But this starts to change when there are more books available, because books become easier to reproduce and less costly. But also when capitalism emerges, when people started to enrich themselves, when people start to see the value of having an education, and when they start to learn reading, and when they start loving doing stuff like, I don't know, writing, poetry, composing music, so on and so forth. So authorship, this idea of individuals as being creators, right? It's an invention of this early modern / Enlightenment period.
It's interesting how that works with, you kind of mentioned with the Lockean concept of property, because although the Lockean concept of property, where you mix your labor with the land, has something to do with scarcity, it also seems kind of like a moral claim based on effort. And a lot of people who are critics of that method of acquiring property, like people like Georgists and socialists and people like this, say that ultimately this would mean that the property is only owned by the people who got there and put their hands in the dirt, and that's not just or equitable. But it's not easy to make a piece. I mean, going back to this idea of the creation of the author and thinking that person did this, like the J.K. Rowling did this, or Stephen King or Pearl Jam, that they made this piece of music and that their effort should be rewarded. This is not about scarcity. This is about rewarding effort, and bringing something into the world that didn't exist before, and that they therefore deserve compensation and maybe rights over it. Is that a good argument, or does that make sense, at least conceptually?
So even if I mean, I used to be more radical on this topic. I'm not as radical as I used to be, let's say, in my youth, even if I'm not necessarily old. But what you're saying makes sense, because I'm not saying in any way that Locke doesn't make sense or that Kant doesn't make sense. I do say, and I will say this every time I get the occasion, that Hegel doesn't make sense. I mean, anyone who's ever read Hegel, hopefully, has
I'm with you on that feeling. One. Yeah.
So Hegel doesn't make sense. Also, the same with regards to thinking about the role of incentives and what incentives and why incentives are important within a utilitarian outlook. It's really interesting, Trevor, to think about the relationship between a creator and his or her creation, right? Because J.K. Rowling created something out of almost nothing. So she didn't actually create that out of nothing. Pearl Jam also created something out of something, right? Because no one creates something ex nihilo, like, I don't know, the Christian cosmology. There was nothing in the beginning, and then God created the earth, or something like this. But it is an effort that creative individuals like musicians, sculptors, I don't know, whatever artist you might think of, actually has to endure in order to produce something. So I guess, and I'm saying this as a critic of the institution of copyrights, that being a creative individual establishes some sort of a moral claim with relation to what you produce. So you can not only reasonably, but you can forcefully claim the status of an author in relation to what you produced. The question is whether having such a moral claim to authorship also entails something that we think of as a property right. And this is where I think, or this is where I find this shift a bit contentious, because it's not clear again if property rights are I don't know, the only institution we could use in order to, let's say, compensate them for the effort that they made during their lifetime in order to bring about pieces of art or artistic productions. So there is no necessary link between, again, having a moral claim to being an author and receiving something that could be considered a property right. There's no necessary condition.
Does this mean that we should conceptually, I guess, if I try to rephrase what you've said, that there's almost like a distinction between copying something and plagiarizing something?
Yeah, that's
in the sense that, like, as the author, I wrote this novel and it's my novel in the sense that I'm the creator of it. I'm the author of it. And so I have a moral right to that relationship to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you copy it, so if we say I don't have property rights in it, then you simply copying it, but like continue to give me credit, doesn't necessarily violate that particular moral claim that I have. But if instead you copy it and stick your own name on it, or potentially take my name off of it, then you've done something wrong because you violated that. And if that's the case, then does that mean that we could see reason to have, say, nothing that looks like copyright, but still laws against or penalties in the case of like outright plagiarism?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm really happy that you made this distinction, because this is also something that I actually had a presentation at the conference on, is especially exactly this topic. Sorry. So having this moral claim to authorship means that plagiarism is really problematic. But in order to argue that plagiarism is problematic, you don't necessarily need property rights in the sense of copyrights. When we began talking about whether or not it makes sense to ascribe property rights in relation to immaterial objects like ideas, we talked a little bit about the role of scarcity, and taking into account the fact that ideas aren't scarce, you cannot say that you're stealing something. Now, when someone plagiarizes something, the difference as opposed to copying is that, well, you actually are stealing something. You're stealing, let's say that you write a book or a poem, and I like it so much that I'm just going to copy it and stick my name onto it, right? You actually have a new book, right? It came out, right? I'm going to just stick my name on the book and say that that's mine. In a case like this, I actually steal something from you. It's a theft of identity. And your identity it's actually a scarce object, right? There's only one Aaron Ross Powell who wrote that book in the world. So it is a case to be made that plagiarism is highly problematic due to, let's say, Lockean concerns or Kantian concerns with regards to authorship. But this doesn't necessarily entail that copying your book, or I don't know, making it available on certain international databases, is necessarily problematic from a moral standpoint. Sure, it is from a legal standpoint, but laws aren't necessarily just all the time.
It's interesting. I like this connection, because there can be many moral duties that arise from the act of authorship, and copyright doesn't have to be one of those. Like if, let's say we got rid of copyright tomorrow, and then J.K. Rowling publishes another Harry Potter book, and someone decides to just republish that book without her name on it, and with a different name on it. Sure, it would be out there in the marketplace, but it might be a violation of some moral code. But it also could be the case that if you go and you buy the non-real one, there's social costs. And people say you're not giving the author money. You should be giving the author money. So if you see someone with a knockoff Harry Potter, you might just chastise them and say, you've done something wrong. Even though we're not going to say you broke any law necessarily, you've done something wrong by buying a knockoff and not giving her due. And that we see that happens with a lot of the sort of name your price. Or people, if you ask them to pay for something of what they're willing to pay on, say, SoundCloud, they will pay, and they think that they should pay. They feel an obligation to pay. So that maybe fulfills the moral claim here without going all the way to copyright.
And I actually fully endorse this. I mean, I do think that we have a supererogatory duty to do this with regards to, I don't know, our favorite musicians, I don't know, writers, poets, so on and so forth. So I really do feel that it's something that we should do. What I find problematic is the idea that people could be punished for copying books or music and making them available in I don't know, digital libraries, or making them available on torrent trackers, or so on and so forth.
Yeah, you have a footnote too in your paper, which was popped in my head even before I saw the footnote, about fashion. It's like they don't have, fashion is a world where there is no intellectual property, and we still revere, and we still have brands, and people still make a lot of money, and there's a lot of innovation. How is that related, do you think, to the freedom of the fashion industry?
Well, I mean, I use this example in order to argue that you don't necessarily need strong copyright protection, or even any copyright protection, in order to have I don't know, to spur creativity, right? It depends a lot on the specific incentives that people have in their own market niche. So I'm not necessarily willing to say that I don't know, were we to abolish our current copyright institutional global framework, we would have, I don't know, more musicians or better music. Though, were we to take a closer look at the music that, I don't know, is quite popular nowadays, and were we to look at the way in which copyright protection has increased, I don't know, maybe there's this bizarre correlation between the two. But going back to my previous idea, it's, again, a counterexample to those who argue that we need strong copyright protection in order to have creativity and even to have profits. And it's something that should make us think whether or not copyright protection in general, or strong copyright protection like we presently have nowadays, is necessary or morally warranted in the first place. And whether or not actually copying stuff is bad, because one of my and it's not fully my contention, but I constantly find it hard to believe that we could have lived in a world with Netflix, Spotify, with Steam, for example, for gamers, with I don't know, 3D cinema, without piracy, and without people who constantly broke laws with regards to copyright protection. Because, and this is something that I mean, I might be wrong. I hope I'm not, but I tend to believe that this ubiquity of copyright infringement in the infancy of the internet is what tended to spur innovation when it comes to offering consumers some sort of a premium.
So far, we've been talking about creative outputs as if they're all kind of the same thing, that there's artists and there's what they make, and then there's markets and copyright and notions of property that exist. But we're really talking about a lot of different markets. There's music, there's books, there's movies, there's fashion, as we just mentioned. And depending on how distinct they are from each other in their features, it might be that, like, finding an example of something functioning in one doesn't necessarily carry over to the other. So let's take the fashion, Radu, that you mentioned earlier as an example of, here's a market that seems to function, incentives that seem to function without copyright. So people there are fashion designers, and they design clothes, and then other companies, other individuals can come along and make copies and sell copies of those clothes. But in fashion, there's a notion of authenticity, that the authentic item is the item that was made by this fashion designer or the fashion designer's brand, and the other things are knockoffs. And so when you go and you see the designer purses for sale at the street vendors in a city, you know that those are knockoffs and they're not the authentic thing. And there's a status with owning the real thing. But in a lot of markets, especially ones for digital content, the notion of authenticity doesn't seem to make much sense. You know, like a authentic Kindle file that I get from Amazon of a Stephen King novel is identical in every way we can think of to that same Kindle file I pirate off of a BitTorrent website. And the experience of owning it is identical. There's no distinguishing the two. Or similar with a file that I download off a BitTorrent of, like an album versus those files streaming to me on Spotify. And so in the absence of that, can we really say that a situation like the fashion industry would work in these other arenas if there's no functional way for authenticity to work?
This is a really good question, and it's a really tough question because, again, it should involve like a tremendous amount of research. But I'm gonna start by totally agreeing with the premise of basically your question, or let's say the assumption, right? Any sane discussion with regards to copyrights should take into account that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, because let's say creativity is so diverse from field to field. So it's interesting to if you were to take a closer look at the fashion industry, right? A lot of what we tend to think about fashion are actually positional goods, right? It's one thing to own a Louis Vuitton bag, but it's a completely different thing to own, I don't know, a Louis Vuitton bag, which looks the same, but it has some different letters switched. When it comes to I don't know, books, as in your example, right? We don't, as you mentioned, actually care about the authenticity of the copy that we own, right? It doesn't actually make a difference for me if I own your book, or if in a physical form, or if I own it on my laptop, if I have it on my laptop, sorry. If my purpose is to, I don't know, read it and use it as a teaching material for my students. Although, were I to make just a short digression, there are ways in which you could talk about authenticity, right? If you own a book which has an autograph, for example, it's something that a copy that you pirated from BitTorrent couldn't actually be thought of as a replacement. But in that case, the book means something more than just, I don't know, the ideas that you have access to by reading it. So going back to what I earlier said, one let's say sane presupposition when it comes to actually discussing about copyright policy in the real world, in this non-ideal world that we live in, is to take a closer look at the fact that there's no one size solution that fits any creative domain, right? It works in fashion, right? Not having copyright protection due to its specificities. Maybe it might not work in music. Maybe due to the fact that, I don't know, artists wouldn't have copyright protection, hypothetically, they would be less creative, and therefore we would have less quality music, so to speak. Now, this is an empirical claim, right? And we could, at least in part, test this claim. And the economists I mentioned in the beginning, Baldwin and Levine, from that book Against Intellectual Monopoly, actually took a closer look at the impact that the introduction of copyright for opera compositions and for opera composers. Okay, so what impact did it have in the 18th century? And one interesting conclusion that they arrived to is that, well, while UK had the strongest copyright regime in place at that specific time and place in the world, they had the fewest composers in Europe at the time. So again, sure, we could say that, well, the world was a bit different, right, in the 18th century. But if it's an empirical claim, this is a way in which we could, well, basically test it and see whether or not we would have people being creative and composing, if we're talking about composers, or writing, if we're talking about authors. If we were to come back to this comparison between fashion and writing books, for example, maybe you could make the case that some small protection could be needed on a broad utilitarian framework, and it's something that and this is an argument that Tom Bell makes from, I don't know if he's still at Mercatus. But if I'm not mistaken, he was also a guest in your podcast, right, a couple of years ago. And his argument is that, well, basically, the biggest problem with the copyright regime and system nowadays, it's actually that it's like Jabba the Hutt. It basically grew, and it's like this disproportionate blob, right? It tends to favor certain specific business interests. And it doesn't actually serve the purpose that it used to serve in I don't know, 1790. That's the date that he goes back to. So as a short answer to your question, I generally tend to say, when it comes to, I don't know, whether or not we should reform our current copyright system, is that first and foremost, we don't need the same copyright regime and copyright protection to each creative field that we might think of. But there is a strong argument to be made in favor for lowering protection for artists, no matter what type of field they're into.
It's interesting because with Aaron's question with fashion, I mean, it could be the case that the authenticity element of fashion, I mean, as you said, it's a positional good also, so that matters. But the authenticity of fashion and what has occurred, one of the things that you learn this in law school if you take intellectual property, is that there is so many of these bags have the logo on them, as the pattern essentially. And one reason for that is because the logos there's a trademark element there where they've adapted a type of authenticity and a method of designing these bags within the property regime that they are in. And if you imagine taking away on these other ones that don't matter as much for authenticity, imagine taking away all the copyright protection. It ends up becoming a business proposition where, you sell super ultimate editions of Harry Potter or Stephen King that are signed. And that's how you say, we're going to give you a special physical copy, so don't buy the knockoff, and all the different things that they could come up with for not buying the knockoff. And maybe even the view of what authentic is would change based on the industry itself changing. And also it's just possibly the case that they're like, musicians are making too much money, and maybe authors are making too much money. Like Spotify, people are complaining all the time on Spotify that the musicians aren't paid enough, but I'm not exactly sure how much musicians should be paid. And people make music for free all the time. I've done it for years. And so that essentially they've captured rents, and that in the face of quote unquote knockoffs, they would have to charge less for or provide a service like Spotify that is so good and so easy that it actually makes pirating no longer attractive, and then to maybe feel like that you're giving something back to the artist too. So all those things together would create a more sort of market friendly and just actually in line with the expectations without rent seeking involved, and something that Hayek I think would be behind.
Yeah, that's quite a Hayekian point, and this is actually one of the points I'm making towards the end of my paper. I try to give this, let's say, broad Hayekian reading of why Spotify or Netflix or other platforms like this appeared, and whether or not we should blame, but in the good sense, copyright infringement and piracy, because. Again, I fail to see how Spotify would emerge without, again, having especially in the infancy of the internet, so many sources for pirating music, for example. And it's interesting, and again, it's something that also happened to me and to a lot of my friends who actually used to do this. So I used to pirate almost everything. I mean, I mostly pirate all the books I have and I've read up to this point. And especially, I mean, philosophy and academic textbooks, which are like really expensive as a result of this forced scarcity. So, I mean, without piracy, Romania would have been even more backwards. So if you consider Romania backwards right now, imagine how bizarre it would be for you to interact with us without having access to pirated books. So it would be absolutely insane. But jokes aside, it's something that, for example, I've stopped doing. So I don't pirate music anymore. I just use Spotify. I started to buy vinyls, however, because I do search for a premium when it comes to this experience.
I'm with you on that.
And it's again, it's interesting because in the absence of piracy, again, I tend to think that it would be, or they would have had a difficult case to make for a service like Spotify or iTunes or the likes. So in this sense, this is another Hayekian, let's say, insight that I deploy in the paper, that piracy, that copyright infringement is a discovery mechanism, right? It's a way in which we as customers could test something and see whether or not it makes sense to endure, let's say, the opportunity cost of paying, I don't know, $20-ish for a vinyl, or I don't know, paying 100 euros for a festival in I don't know, Belgium or something like this. And there are some studies who tend to mostly agree with this point, that the people who are most prone to actually spend more money on movies, on books, on music, or on live performances are people who actually have this mixed pattern of pirating, but also of buying stuff. So it's not the people who tend to avoid totally piracy that are the most willing to give more money, for example, to artists in concerts. So I guess this is one of the this is one of the benefits, the fundamental benefits that actually piracy brought forth for artists, companies, and generally to the market. It, again, just to make an analogy with Spotify, think about how immersive and interesting the gaming experience is nowadays, as opposed to how it used to be, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, all my friends pirated their video games. Now all of them are on Steam, and it's a social event. It's not only, I don't know, a random guy or a random girl just sitting in I don't know, at her desk and playing WoW. It's a social experience. It's an immersive social experience that it's actually a premium that Blizzard is offering, as opposed to just having a pirated version on your laptop. But again, I do see a correlation between these two.
I can completely confirm that I used to pirate a ton of music, and I did it as a music discovery mechanism. I would look at all the concerts that were coming to town and download stuff of the bands without knowing that if I'd want to go to the show. And then even after I downloaded something, I would then go and buy their vinyl because I didn't feel like I really owned it, and I wanted to give back to the artist. Now, I'm not sure that I'm normal in that regard, and I also have a lot of vinyl records, but it shows that it's possible to think about how free sharing of stuff can help out the artists themselves and change their business model. I mean, as someone, as an intellectual who writes things, I would not want my stuff to be locked down under the kind of copyright that would make it illegal to copy it or things like this. And someone says, oh, I listened to, or I read your piece, or if we had free thoughts on some sort of, paywall or something, that's not better for what you're trying to accomplish. And most musicians would say, I just ultimately want people to listen to my stuff.
It seems, though, I'll go back to things being different for different markets, that these arguments, the one market that seems like it would not function in this regime is movies. So right now, yeah, we have Netflix and Amazon Prime and HBO Go, and this ever growing list of services you can pay $5 to $15 a month to get access to. But the reason that we have that is because copyright was enforced. And so what I mean is that you subscribe to Netflix because it has some titles that you want to watch. You don't really subscribe to Netflix. It has like the robust discovery system that like Spotify has. Spotify brings a lot of value on top of just giving you access to an enormous catalog. Netflix doesn't. The other ones really don't. It's just this is the easiest way to get access to these things. But I think the reason that it's the easiest way to get access to these things is because making an easy access system that skirts copyright is risky for those people who would do it. And so like by way of example, there was an app that was around for a while, I think called like Popcorn Time, that you could download on your computer, and basically was Netflix for BitTorrent. So you'd load it up and you would see a list of just like, cover art for a whole bunch of movies, often movies that were still in the theaters. And you just double clicked on one and it started playing. And you could stream it to your television and whatever. And you could also, it had a search engine. So it was basically a Netflix interface, but behind the scenes, it was BitTorrent and it was pirating things. And the reason that that so many people are willing to pay $15 a month for Netflix is because Popcorn Time is prevented from rolling out to as many platforms and as widely because of copyright. And movies in particular, like you want to support the artists, but we don't tend to think of movies that way. There's some people who are really into them who will buy, the DVD just to support the independent filmmaker, but most people won't. You don't really tend to buy much merchandising for most films because films are like I watched it once and I'm done with it. Whereas an album is something that, like I'm going to listen to this album hundreds of times. So is that market sufficiently different that is the story of the emergence of Netflix and Amazon Prime different from the story of the emergence of Spotify? And is it the case that, if we got rid of copyright in movies, especially with digital distribution, that we basically wouldn't have a film industry? So Trevor can sit at home and he can make music. Trevor can't sit at home and make a movie. These are incredibly expensive things to make that require a whole bunch of people, huge upfront costs, and so on. They're not really, there are student films and amateur films, but most of us only watch those on when Red Letter Media makes fun of them on YouTube. Is that industry sufficiently different that this story doesn't work with it?
So this is like a really good question, because you're absolutely right. The fixed costs associated with producing a blockbuster, for example, are pretty huge. But I would have some let's say counter questions. I know I usually don't answer to questions with some questions, but I do have some, let's say, more or less rhetorical questions. Do we actually really need another Avengers movie?
Yes, we do. Sorry, Radu, we do.
I don't know, man. I like you, but I don't side with you on this. Sure, we wouldn't have movies like this anymore, maybe, because another claim that I make in my paper is that what about crowdfunding, right? And platforms like this, like Kickstarter, for example. Could they prove to be a useful way of basically producing art and artistic goods like movies, documentaries, music, so on and so forth? Well, there are some positive, let's say, results of musicians or even movie producers who financed at least part of their movies through such financing, but not at the level needed for, producing another Avengers movie. But the thing is, copyrights tend to distort the market, right? Because they force scarcity, and that's why things actually cost more than they should cost. That's why you have to pay actresses so much. That's why you have basically fixed costs associated. That's why, at least in part, the fixed costs are so high. But to coming to a previous point I made, I mean, if we're talking about, I don't know, reforming the current copyright regime and system, maybe if, I don't know, we say like Trevor that we need another Avengers movie, then maybe we could still say as libertarians or classical liberals that there should be a case for a minimal protection when it comes to copyrights in relation to movies. But what's interesting, and where I actually don't necessarily fully agree with what you said, Aaron, is that, and I used to do this, especially when writing my PhD thesis, because actually my PhD thesis is about this, about torrenting stuff, piracy, and then the, let's say, ethical implications of this. And I used to do this each year when I was enrolled as a grad student here in Bucharest. And I took a closer look at the movies, the top 10 movies with the biggest budgets of the year, and the amount of time that it was copied, torrented, pirated online. And it's interesting that actually there's actually a positive correlation between the amount of downloads and the success at the box office. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a correlation between those two, but it's obvious that having a movie that's heavily pirated doesn't negatively impact your income. And again, even if piracy used to be, because piracy actually is decreasing as alternatives like Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu appear. Even when piracy was, let's say, internet piracy, online piracy was in its prime, actually the budgets for movies increased. Actually, the movie-going experience began to be more immersive because more 3D technology was being used. And it's stuff that you cannot have at home, regardless of the fact that you have, I don't know, the most complex home cinema system available. So it could still be a case, we could still make a case that copyright infringement at least should be tolerated and not criminally prosecuted, because it would be quite difficult to actually argue that piracy, for example, and illegal copies actually harm the financial interests of actors, of producers, of companies like, I don't know, Disney. And having mentioned Disney, I'm pretty sure that they're going to make a lot of money by selling, I don't know, Baby Yoda trinkets than by, I don't know, the amount of money that they'll receive through online movie streaming platform.
I think you hit something important where you would have to, clearly there is a huge demand for these big Avengers movies. And I'm definitely one of those people. And so tomorrow IP goes away and you try and figure out how you can make sure that, we can make this movie and the people can come see it, but it won't be copied in a way that affects that it's not worth it to make the movie in the first place. And so, I mean, you could imagine theaters buying theaters that are essentially locked down. So you say you kickstart this, and if you want to come see it on the big screen with all these technologies that Radu mentioned, we're going to put it in 3D, we're going to put it with smell-o-vision and all this crazy stuff to get you to come to the theater. And then you go to this place and you have to, they're not going to let you film it or anything, and you pay to get in and experience it like an amusement park ride. I still think that they would exist, but even better, this is the most important part, Radu, there would be tons more Avengers movies because it wouldn't just be owned by Disney. We could all go make an Avengers movie right now. We could make 30 different Spider-Man movie, and the one that's trying to win is not because they own the IP. Anyone can make a Spider-Man movie, but you have to make the best Spider-Man movie to get people to come out. So it'd actually be even better. It'd be so many Marvel movies, Radu, you wouldn't even be able to contain yourself.
And we might actually have, I don't know, a better ending for Game of Thrones.
Yes, that too, because someone would just go to remake it.
Yeah. And there's also, I mean, because Aaron, you mentioned J.K. Rowling. There's so many good fiction written by amateur writers, by people again who aren't professional writers, like J.K. Rowling. Sorry. So stuff written within the universe of J.K. Rowling, which can only exist on I don't know, forums online, and cannot be sold by by those individuals, because, well, they would infringe on J.K. Rowling's copyright to the universe that she created. So yeah, I mean, Trevor, yeah, that's also a point I should have made. Yeah, I mean, not having copyright protection for Avengers might actually mean that this could be a way of spurring innovation. But it would also be important to, let's say, rethink the way, the consumer ethics that we have. So were we to live in a world without copyright protection, or without strong copyright protection, if we like something, if we like Avengers, then we should be the types of individuals that should contribute to, crowdfunding campaigns to finance, the production of our preferred Avengers scenario. Presently, and I wanted to say this, I wanted to sneak this idea in a special context, and I guess this is it. It's something that my former PhD supervisor mentioned at a certain point when we were talking, and it's not something that I actually spend a lot of time thinking about, but I always found it such a fascinating idea. So at one point he said something like, well, Radu, don't you think that copyrights in a way function as minimum wage laws? And I mean, when he first told me this, I was like, I don't know what's exactly the link, but technically they actually function the same way in which minimum wage law functions, right? You need to pay someone something like this, otherwise you don't have access to that. It's also a way of, making something that isn't scarce, or isn't as scarce as it would be if you institute it, scarcer. So it's something that I guess we should take into account, right? The let's say pragmatics of instituting copyright protection, be it strong or not. But I am gonna say that, well, I have no idea whether or not a world without complete copyright protection when it comes to movies might actually be work like I'm saying right now. But I'm positive that we don't need a strong copyright protection in order to have access to a ton of immersive experience when it comes to movies, books, music, so on and so forth.
The core of the Hayekian project, as it pertains to building out the rules of a society, is a focus on spontaneous order from bottom-up growth, and a recognition that knowledge is widely dispersed throughout society, and that we're typically better off if people can act upon their localized knowledge and then use markets and prices and mechanisms of that sort to aggregate that knowledge, rather than, really smart people at the top trying to command things. Given that, and given that we currently have a entertainment industry, a publishing industry, a music industry, a fashion industry, and so on, that exist within these regimes of robust copyright, how do we apply the Hayekian analysis going forward? If we're good Hayekians and we want to replace copyright with a bottom-up system, how do we go about that? Do we just abolish the whole thing and see what evolves?
That could be, let's say, a plausible strategy, right? Let's see what institutions emerge as a result of human action and not of human design. And there are some arguments that for example, David Friedman and other libertarians or anarcho-capitalists tend to argue for, which are, they aren't necessarily Hayekians, but they do make some sort of a point which is similar to the whole spontaneous order tradition, that you could have competing, let's say, legal frameworks for intellectual production protection. So this could be a really interesting social, political, and moral experiment, right? Just trash the whole system, and see what emerges, and especially see what emerges if you don't have cronyism, right? Because right now you have big companies like Disney, like Sony, who constantly lobby governments worldwide to increase the level of protection for the goods that they buy. Because, and it's something that a lot of the people who actually tend to argue within a Lockean or Kantian framework, in favor for intellectual property, tend to I don't know, they just tend to minimize the importance of this. So they spend a lot of time talking about the moral claim that that individuals have in relation to their creation, right? Kantians and then Hegelians say that, well, we should own, I don't know, a poem or a musical composition because it's basically a part of our personality, of our identity. It's a way of asserting basically your will in the external world. But if you take a closer look at who owns most intellectual property, well, it's not artists. It's mostly again big companies who use their power to lobby the government. It's not I don't know, small artists actually trying to make a living. Most of them are more or less either in favor of abolishing copyrights altogether, or in favor of a weaker protection for copyrights. So were we to do this, were we to again burn it all down, like, I don't know, Rome burned, and let's see what emerges from this. I don't necessarily know whether a no copyright world would emerge. I'm not so sure. But I'm pretty sure that without cronyism, the world that would emerge would be one with fundamentally less copyright protection and with fundamentally more creativity.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy Free Thoughts, make sure to rate and review us in Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast app. Free Thoughts is produced by Landry Ayers. If you'd like to learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.